Hey, Monica.
Hey, Jennifer.
Monica, I'm so excited to share today's episode with our listeners. If you've enjoyed our past conversations about our relationship to animals, then this one is definitely for you.
Yes, so today we're talking to Brandon Kim, author of Meet the Neighbors, Animal Life and Minds in a More Than Human World. This book takes a deep look at animal intelligence and emotions and shares the latest research. And it crucially asks the questions, what do we then do with this information?
Yes, and Brandon is a journalist who specializes in science, nature, and animals. His work has appeared in publications like National Geographic, the New York Times, The Atlantic, and even Wired. He is also the author of The Eye of the Sandpiper, which was published in 2017.
And in this conversation, we explore the question of what we owe animals, the concept of animal personhood, and what legal rights animals should be entitled to, and then how can we have really nuanced conversations about those issues.
Yes, it's so fascinating and so thought provoking.
Brandon, thank you so much for being wait, let me start over. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. It's been a bit of a week with all of this crazy weather. We lucked out in Atlanta and did not have too terrible of a time compared to our neighbors up north. We're very, very, very worried about them. But we're so excited you'd be with us. Jen is here too. How are you, Jennifer?
Great. I'm so excited, Brandon. We have been talking about you nonstop, and we love your work and what you talk about. So we're interested in just to kind of dive in and just to give us a little bit of your background.
Well, thank you both so much. It's lovely to be here. And so a little bit of background about me. So I'm a science journalist. So I became a science journalist because it really just let me explore everything that I was curious about through the lens of science. And over time, I was writing more and more about animal intelligence and about nature, which is just that's kind of always been passions of mine ever since I was a little kid, trying to keep caterpillars in jars.
So did you know that you wanted to go into journalism versus say something directly with
Oh,
animals, whether that was like veterinary or studying or, biology or anything? Did you know you always wanted to write?
it was much more the latter. I always loved writing and sort of imagined that I would be a writer, and I ended up sort of going into the advocacy side of things for a while. Just sort of became frustrating to me the way that, advocacy is always just about one side of things. And I wanted just more freedom to explore. And that's how I went into journalism. And then the science part, kind of the idea that I would be writing about science came later. And then the focus on nature and animals came after that.
I love that. And this is like one of our favorite topics too, because I mean, you've written a lot, and I know we're going to dive into your latest book, Meet the Neighbors, Animal Minds, the Life in a More Than Human World. Is very exciting to Monica and myself, and I know a lot of our listeners, because we are so invested in that connection between, how do we exist together versus like, nature's there and humans are here, and animals are there and we're a better species, like all this separation. And I love that your book, that again, we're going to dive into, really kind of ties that knot of like why we have to look at ourselves as this interwoven web of beings on this planet we call Earth.
For sure.
Well, and then I'll just add on to that. I like the language of the
Mm.
sentient and the animal personhood. So I'll just sort of put that there and let you react to that because I think those are really important words to use.
Yeah. Yeah. So I should say a little bit more about the genesis of Meet the Neighbors. And, so for a time I really found myself writing a lot about the science of animal intelligence and what we know about animal minds. And the last few decades have really been a flourishing moment for the scientific study of animal intelligence. And it's not that you need the science to understand that animals are intelligent, right? Like there's lots of ways in which at different times, science has been kind of catching up to, what people are able to see for themselves. But that being said, the science really, can illuminate new dimensions and really measure things in a rigorous way so that claims just kind of can't be dismissed as anthropomorphism or projection. It just really, yeah, shows new dimensions of things. So, so at first the book was going to be about just the science of animal intelligence, basic, straightforward stuff. But what really became more interesting to me, and I think more compelling in the world, is like what do we do with all of this knowledge and these insights, right? Like, do we just sort of take them on board and go about our way and just be like, oh, well, that's neat, or does it change the way we think about other animals and how we relate to them and just encourage a conversation? So this is something that I think has been explored when it comes to the animals who we, use for food or in research or as companions, of course, or to work for us. But when it comes to wild animals, those conversations have been slower to happen. And I think it's in part because, when you think about it, the way that we think about nature often doesn't include a sense of animals as individuals and fellow persons. And whether it's talking about, these ideas of nature as a source of beauty and transcendence, or, the more recent frameworks of conservation, and environmentalism writ large, sustainability, none of those really include a sense of the animals themselves, which isn't to say that conservationists, environmentalists, and other people don't think about animals that way, but just that, those ideas sort of aren't part of the official frameworks of nature. And so that's what Meet the Neighbors explores. And, the idea of personhood, which I agree, it's such a powerful term. You say the word person and there's just a significance to it. And, there's different definitions of personhood, and there's sort of the philosophical definition. It was Immanuel Kant who had defined a person as basically someone who was an end unto themselves and not just a means to somebody else's end, right? Like, a someone, not a something.
Yeah.
Right.
But then there's also the legal definition of personhood, which is basically, a person is an entity capable of bearing a legal right. That's a very dry way of saying it. But one of the people I write about, or the efforts I write about, is the Non-Human Rights Project, who are a group who have been seeking recognition of legal personhood for captive chimpanzees and then more recently elephants. Their founder, the late Stephen Wise, he would always sort of get irritated when there would be headlines saying that, they wanted the same rights for animals as existed as humans have. And he would say, no, I'm not looking for a right to education or affordable housing or all that stuff. I'm looking or to vote, right? Like, looking for one single right to set a precedent. The animals can have rights, and then we can have a discussion about what those rights should be, what they should be for different species and different contexts. But of course, part of the reason why this has been shut down in the courts and why there's opposition from some people, is that the Non-Human Rights Project has also been pretty transparent that, once you set this precedent, we can also have these conversations for chickens and cows and pigs and what have you. And a lot of people are just afraid of that. And rather than having those conversations, they're just like, no, we won't even say that chimpanzees or elephants have a right to be free.
I know. And I think it's an interesting challenge, with, the animals that we eat, because I think a lot of people, and I'll include myself in it because I don't want to other everybody else, is that, we want to continue doing this thing that we do. And so we don't want to ask the hard questions, because if we ask the hard questions, we're going to have to make a sacrifice, and we're not good at sacrifice. We just say it, right? And whatever that might be, right? And you start with the pigs and you're going to end up with the chickens, right? So don't take away my bacon. So I think it's a really tough conversation, and so much of it can be so strident. Certain groups can be so strident that there's almost a visceral reaction with people when those conversations come up, versus having a more nuanced dialogue, which I think your book starts to do. It starts to, Jen and I always say, once you start educating people, you can't undo that information. And so how can you provide it in a more nuanced, thoughtful way, versus you're a bad person if you do this thing, or you can't do this anymore. So I really, really admire what you're doing. And, you are continuing your advocacy, even, by writing and sharing these stories in really broad publications like the New York Times and Nat Geo and Wired. So I think it's really important. What was it that, was it just all your time that sort of came to these questions? I mean, it sounds like when we did a sound check at the beginning for our listeners, and you were saying you had a vegan slice of something. So are you a vegan? Because I think that's, my husband is much more thoughtful than I am about what he's eating, and I try to eat less and less. Like we don't we don't cook any meat at home, but we do some fish. So then where's the line there? But tell me about, your own personal journey.
So, first of all, I'm really glad that, the book felt like it, brought these points up in a very accessible way that, wasn't, that wasn't talking about how some people are right and some people are wrong, because I think, there's so many perspectives, on these
Absolutely.
questions. And it's I think a book is a good place to have these conversations, even better in person. Social media is the last place any of us should be
I
doing
know.
this, right?
Terrible.
Like, just
Yes,
boom.
I know.
Don't even get
So
us started
bad.
on that.
And then, I also do just want to say that, I think of myself as being an advocate in the broadest possible terms of just saying, okay, these are, when it comes to nature or when it comes to animals, just saying that there are a great many people who have certain values or see things a certain way. And I think that those perspectives, deserve to be part of the conversation, and that these conversations are worth having. And, that kind of might sound like a semantic difference, but, it's not like I'm not a journalist in order to, advance an animal rights agenda, or I'm not, a journalist, but also a secret representative of the Nature Conservancy. And it's kind of, and I just say that because the way that we talk about animals in journalism is kind of loaded and unclear in ways that maybe other subjects aren't. So like if I'm writing about climate change, or I'm writing about, God forbid, child trafficking or something like that, nobody is going, or writing about cancer and, the quest to end cancer. Nobody is going to expect a journalist to be completely in the middle without any preference for whether or not we solve cancer, or whether or not we solve climate change. But then if I'm seen as a journalist who's advocating for animals, then suddenly that's much more loaded. So anyways, I just wanted to say I'm not an advocate. So in saying all those things, I lost the thread of your original question.
Well, I think when I say you're an advocate, I think education to me, education is advocacy, because I think if the more we can share information about any topic,
Absolutely.
then we
Absolutely.
can potentially have dialogue, that hopefully thoughtful dialogue off social media. And then we can talk about the nuances, and then we can all land on our own opinion or our own decision, because that is our own right to make our choices.
Totally.
But I do think that we're starting, I think just with like the slow food and organic and know your farmer and those movements, and understanding I'll call it advocacy for, let's just talk like free range eggs, right? It's kind of an inanimate object in a way, right? Like take it away from the chicken. Like, so I think most people at this point are like, yeah, we would prefer that those chickens are not smashed in a little cage, or, any of the animals, like they definitely should have better conditions, right? So I think most people would agree with that. Once you explain that to them, is this a good thing for any of the farmed animals? And I think even that we're farming them is a problem in my head. And so, can we at least all agree that those animals during their life, what if they could just be, they could fulfill their chickenness or whatever, And so, but that's hard to translate to the plate, right? But I think at least we could say we all agree that they shouldn't have to live this way. And I don't want to even get into all of the negative things. And then at least we can start there, and then say, well, let's just ask the questions before it gets on the plate of where it came from. We're starting to do that with vegetables.
Yeah.
And so we're starting to do that with animals, how they got here. But I'll sort of take it out of that conversation. That's not really why, well, unless you want to dig in more, but I really want to go into the science too. So
yeah. Well, very, very quickly, I remembered as you were saying that the original question was asking me about my own journey and my own practices.
Yeah.
So I just
Oh, yeah.
really
Yeah.
briefly wanted to say that, I'm mostly vegan now, by which I mean that, as a rule, I don't buy or consume animal products, although I'm fine with honey. I have no problem with honey. But, if somebody prepares a meal, with animal with me, I'll eat that because I think accepting hospitality is very important.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, like in a pinch, my mom's birthday was this weekend. I was going to bake her a cake. I did not have time to bake her a cake. I got a little cake from somewhere and I didn't,
Sure.
look real hard at where it was coming from. And I know, and I should be
Mm-hmm.
more rigorous about that sort of thing. But at the same time, like I'm not a perfect person. And this has been a journey, that occurred across its years. It wasn't just like one day, it was all or nothing. It was just one day I thought, oh, these animals really matter. And then it took
Mm-hmm.
years to kind of put that in practice.
Miranda, like what you were just saying too, because what your work on this book in particular helped me understand is also like what we say is words matter
Oh,
and how we use our words. Like, and we think about this in social media or just media in general of like pests. So day-to-day animals like doves or pigeons or rats or mice are pests, but how do we look at them as part of this living ecosystem in our own backyard? Because I know, I'm sure you know Richard Liu,
yeah.
and all of his talk about we can't love and protect that which we don't know or understand, and this is all like in our very own backyard, because I know you talk about this in your book as well, of how do we then circumvent better conversations from our you don't have to go far. We always say you don't have to go far, just like know what's happening in your own backyard, have a better understanding on this little microcosm of a bigger ecosystem. And your book does that, because it's like these words really have intentionality to help us better comprehend and understand why we kind of think differently. Or just maybe I'm like, wow, I didn't think about this sentence or this idea before. So now I'm thinking about it differently. So your book's been very helpful with that.
Thank you. That's important to me. Like sort of, we just our society, just puts things into all these different categories, and it's like, oh,
Yes.
this animal's a pest, this animal's feral, this animal's invasive, this is wild, this is not wild, who belong, and I mean, there's some utility to having words to describe things, but I think it's important to. There's a lot of utility to having words to describe things. I say as a writer. But there's a lot of value in interrogating those and questioning them, and but it's not all, of course, just like an intellectual exercise or an ethical exercise. Like people love the animals around them, they're like, we're just talking about squirrels or pigeons or whatever,
Yeah.
everybody, they bring a little joy to everyone's lives, and I think part of what I was trying to do. I was saying earlier, it was originally just going to be a book about animal intelligence, but basically the first section is a compressed version of that book, but it's putting the findings onto the creatures, of a typical Eastern North American suburban neighborhood, and really seeing the animals around us. A lot of times books about animal intelligence are really about, kind of the, like the obviously super brainy species, right? Like parrots and dolphins and cetaceans and other great apes and, all these animals
Yeah.
who like we know they're really smart, right? But, it's also like, I also want to talk about garter snakes and field mice and
Right.
squirrels,
Yeah.
and the turtles on the log. And, there's so much intelligence out there.
Yeah. So tell us, give us some examples of the animal intelligence that you highlight in the book, like any of your favorites that you might have.
Um, So one of the trends in the science over the last few decades, has been sort of back in the beginning, everything was about like the, straightforward intelligence, right? Like problem solving and memory and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But scientists have become a lot more comfortable, talking about emotion and also coming up with ingenious ways of assessing emotion in other creatures. And so like one of my absolute favorite emotion studies involves the emotions of bumblebees. And, you know, we can think of them as being, as being happy or unhappy, being in a good mood or not in a good mood. And it's just like right now I'm looking out the window and there's a kind of a big clump of frost aster in a patch that's gone unmowed for a long time. And, it's late fall. It's just swarming with bees right now. Some level, like thinking of them, like, all right, they're having a pretty good day. They're not long for this world. but,
Yes.
their experience of the world is an emotional one too. And then kind of in a similar vein with that, like, sociality and social relationships. And of course, like, like the fabric of our own lives, our relationships and the people who matter to us are really what make life worth living. And, and of course we know that animals are social, but I think there's kind of been a tendency not to think of their sociality as being as meaningful to them as it is to us. And just some of the society stories that I love involve the relationships that exist. Certainly there's many birds like Canada geese who are known to be lifetime monogamous, or if not, completely monogamous, then they do have mates across many years, but also migratory birds. And thinking of, the fact that bird migrations are ongoing right now, and they're not just, these are not just sort of like random constellations of birds moving across the sky, but you see, there was this amazing study of a species called European bee eaters a few years ago, and they migrate between, Western Europe and equatorial Africa. It's this incredible journey. And the researchers put these little tags on them that, sort of let them know, who was where in a really fine-grained way over the course of this journey. And, like those little groups of birds, they are sticking together across thousands of miles. And if they get separated, they usually find one another again at their final destination. But to think of migration as being not just this like incredible physiological and navigational achievement, but also having that social dimension is again, just makes it so much richer too.
Yeah, the social dimension is just fascinating. One of the things that I think maybe people are a little more familiar with is the octopus, right? That they're I can't think of the book. My mom just read it for her book club.
What is My Octopus Teacher?
Yeah. Right? And then there was a movie, and then there was a documentary.
Yep.
And so I think people that have watched that or read that book are like, I am never having calamari again.
That's me.
And I think that's really interesting because, again,
never again.
It just completely changed their behavior based on not just education, but honestly storytelling, because what you did was just tell a story about those little birds who found each other. And so I think we're so taken, humans as a species are so taken with stories that if you can put a good story together, like your book, then that also, changes, or even some of your articles, are so great, like Secrets of Animal Communication or The Genius of Dogs, which you did for National Geographic. I just think storytelling's so important. So I guess that was a statement, not a question. So I'm curious. And so my next question for you is sort of back to that personhood that we started off talking to a minute ago. You talked about the non-human rights project, but we didn't talk about what that right is. So what is the right that they're trying to advocate for? And what do you think, like, what should they have? What should animal rights have? Is it freedom? Is it the right to be them? Like, dig in a little bit more about that sort of personhood concept for an animal.
Sure. So I think, so as I mentioned earlier, there's, a few different ways of thinking about personhood. There's the someone, not a something, and then the legal case. And so, just speaking to the philosophical side of things first, leaving aside the courts and the law and, all those complications, what are the rights an animal should have? And, again, there's many perspectives on this, and, I don't want to just like come in hot and be like, I know how everything should be. It's my way. But I do think it's fair to say that all persons, human beings or animals should have their interests acknowledged and considered and weighed, whenever we're having those conversations, and I think, we can then have a discussion later about whether, sort of what more specific rights should look like. Are there some things that, should be done or should never be done? All of that can come out in the conversation, but I think fundamentally you just recognize and acknowledge their interests. And I think also this is a speculative statement. I don't know if there's any empirical grounding to back it up, but But I think the habits of mind we have towards
Mm-hmm.
animals sort of are very easily turned towards people. It's like we learn to think
Yes.
one way in
Mm-hmm.
one context, or I should say turn towards humans, and then we take that way of thinking and we apply it in a different place. And so I think the more we recognize that animals' interests deserve to be taken into account and just can't be ignored or thrown out the window because we've decided to put a label on them, then also the more likely we are to treat human beings that way. And that's
Mm-hmm.
a very important part of this conversation. And then as for the legal side of things and what the Non-Human Rights Project is seeking, their cases are just, like, I don't know, like if any of your listeners or viewers want to geek out, read the lawsuits that the Non-Human Rights Project filed on behalf of chimpanzees, and then chimpanzees,
Wow.
like they are just like incredible pieces of intellectual scholarship that are talking not only about, the science, basically everything that's known in the science of
Sure.
chimpanzee intelligence and elephant intelligence, which is there and super interesting in its own right. But they're also talking about, like the fundaments of the law and how it is that we think
Mm-hmm.
about rights and what are the qualities and capacities that make somebody qualify for a right in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And they're just incredible works of scholarship. Like you learn so much about
Mm-hmm.
the women's rights movement and the abolition movement and just all these other
Mm.
things. But the single right that they have been seeking so far is to say that a chimpanzee or an elephant cannot be arbitrarily imprisoned, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
nobody can just go take a human being, put him in a cage and, without a
Yeah.
very good reason for doing it, at least.
Mm-hmm.
And if it does happen, then that person has the right to contest that imprisonment, say, hey, wait a second, this is unjust. This
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't have been done. And that's what the Non-Human Rights Project is saying for elephants and chimps.
So where does that fall with zoos? Because that's where we're
Well,
imprisoning these animals, right? How, like, where is because I think it's a super interesting concept. Having now almost college age boys, it was a joy to go to the zoo and see the elephants and the chimpanzees. They were some of the top probably animals that people wanted to see, maybe after the lions, tigers, and penguins. Although the lemurs are really cute too. But we are placing them in an unnatural environment. It's such an interesting thing, and I think one of the things is like we just don't think about it. We just go to the zoo. The zoo's been there
Exactly. Yeah.
forever. We don't think about what we're doing to these animals. So where's the conservation? Like, I'm sure there's a ton of, well, they're all going to get killed. We have to protect them somehow. Oh, must be such an interesting conversation to debate.
I think it's such an interesting conversation that I think it's not an all or nothing black and white thing, right? Like
Right.
I do think when it comes to chimpanzees and elephants, what they need to live a life that is truly good for them is just
Mm-hmm.
really incommensurate with what zoos in practice make available to them.
Mm-hmm.
There are examples of places where, the Non-Human Rights Project wasn't saying that, poor Happy the elephant, who has essentially been in captivity her entire life, can just suddenly
Right.
plunk down and
Be let out.
right?
Yeah. She won't know what to do. Yeah.
Yeah. So she would have gone to an elephant sanctuary, where at least it's a much better life than she has now at the Bronx Zoo.
Mm-hmm.
And then chimpanzees, there are also chimpanzee sanctuaries and what have you. But anyways, yeah, like I think, there are some species where captivity is just, or at least zoo style captivity is just off the
Mm-hmm.
table. But I think there's many
Mm-hmm.
other species where it's a conversation to have. And there's some species,
Mm-hmm.
some animals who I think are, do perfectly well in zoos and others less so. And that's just something to talk through. And, one of the, just really quickly, like one of the arguments that is sometimes made, was made, in defense of Happy's confinement and saying, well, she's getting everything she needs, right? Like the reason why in the wild she'd be walking tens of miles and doing all these things and using her mind, was
Yeah.
because she had to in order to survive. And, but we're giving her everything she needs in this little space. And I think if you think about applying that argument to a human being, then it just completely
Exactly.
falls apart. And so I think it's
Exactly.
important to, to think these things through.
I'm kind of changing course, but not because I'm just curious to think what your opinion is on this. And if you feel like there's a bigger interest even now in learning about how animals communicate with one another and humans, but this whole rise of AI intelligence trying to learn the languages of animals. What do you like? What do you think? I mean, I think that's so interesting that they're trying to then like code what the whales are saying. And I saw it in a TV show like 2 years ago, and I thought, oh my God, it's actually happening.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts around? Do you think that will help people have more interest in, I don't know, understanding?
I'm glad you asked that because I have opinions.
Oh, please share. I know.
On the one hand, like I think, anybody who wants to better try to understand other animals, like go for it. Like the more we do that, the better it is. And I think, the suite of computational tools that we call AI are incredibly powerful and sort of do open up new avenues for better understanding. But what frustrates me a bit about kind of the discourse around this subject is the way that communication is sort of framed as a primary, like everything is about vocal communication, right? And so much of animal communication and so much of human communication is not vocal and also not necessarily linguistic, right? Like we can sort of debate about, whether other animals have language. And, I think to me, the most compelling argument is that we need to stop thinking about language as sort of like on the one side, there's language and on the other side, there's nothing. Rather, there's just, a whole spectrum of communicative complexity. And some of it, rises to the level of having syntax and recursion and all these other things that are really important to humans. But, even without those things, you can convey so much meaning. And I think that gets lost in the conversation about AI. And actually, a wonderful paper for people to look up, and actually where the epitaph for Meet the Neighbors comes from was written by an anthropologist named Barbara Smuts, who lived with baboons for a time, basically became part of their community for a big part of each day. And, and really came to appreciate, their communications and their relation. And then she went back home and she just became very close to her dog. And much of the paper is just about the relationship she had with this dog, how they communicated with each other. And like, it was very, like, if you have a dog or you know dogs well, like, like so much of the communication that you have with them, it's not verbal. It's about, gaze.
How you see each other. Yes.
Yeah. And, and I just think, hopefully AI can illuminate that as well, but it's not necessary for it. And we should just remember that communication is so much richer than just spoken language.
Agree. I agree 100%.
Yeah, my dog will sit in front of the ice maker because she wants ice.
Yes. There you go.
Like, you want ice? I don't know if she's supposed to have it, but we give it to her. So tell me a little bit about like the reaction you're getting. Like, what are you hearing from people, and like what's important that's sort of rising to the top that maybe you weren't expecting?
Yeah, so it's so I think by temperament, I'm somebody who kind of doesn't notice praise, but like the criticisms will absolutely stick.
Of course.
So I've kind of so there's I've heard from a great many people how Meet the Neighbors has resonated with them, or sort of illuminated new dimensions of the life around them, or it gave them an intellectual framework for thinking about things. But kind of what I focus most on are the people who are critical of it in some way. And so one thing that I do hear, I have heard more than I expected, is that I thought when I was writing it, I really tried hard not to talk too much about the bad stuff, right? Like not to linger on, some people treat coyotes or ways in which, the animals don't always live their best lives when they meet us. And so I thought I kind of went soft on that. And some people are like, oh, there's a lot of that. Some of it's really dark. And So I don't think of the book that way, but, sort of maybe I became sensitized over time. And for people who are sort of coming to this new, there's a little more of the serious stuff than you would just expect in kind of a gee whizzy fun book about animal intelligence.
Gee whizzy. I like that.
And then, I also, when I wrote Meet the Neighbors, I didn't think about this framework, of thinking of other animals as persons and, seeing the animals who live around us, not as kind of invaders into our space, but, residents of a shared space. That idea, is obviously like very, very relevant to actual neighborhoods. But I thought of it as kind of an ethos that, applies at the largest scales and in wild places as well. But I think for many people, it really is resonating in that like very everyday, the animals around them way, which is neat. And I think it also speaks to how, there's just such a delight we take in animals, all of us, and a sort of a desire to connect with them, just beyond, seeing them and being like, oh, that's a promontory warbler, or, oh, that's a pretty animal. Like, we all want this sense of connection.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is incredible. And it's like, again, back to once we can't protect it unless we understand it. And then we have to, love it. Because we may understand a
Totally.
cockroach. He or she still needs their own life, I guess. But, we've defined that as a nuisance. So thinking about distinctions between, because we talked about it initially, like suburban, kind of a suburban area versus urban versus rural, which is where Serenbe is. We have a ton of deer. Like there was a bobcat I saw the other day. But even in suburban areas, we have coyotes. So talk a little bit about that, the different geography or types of geography.
Sure. I think really the big lesson to me is that, when it comes to wild animals in like very wild and remote places, then our relationships to them, like, it's pretty easy, right? Like, just don't bother them. Don't hurt them. Let them keep on doing their thing. And it's kind of not all that complicated. And like we can make it more complicated with sort of intellectual questions about, the sorts of obligations you might have to, to a starving polar bear, or whether some species, should be reintroduced, or, things like that. But I feel like, it's not all that complicated. But with the animals who are all around us in cities and suburbs, or, even if you're in a rural place, like, the environs immediately around your community, those animals, things get more complicated because like we're entangled with them and vice versa. And so I just sort of think that's a useful way of kind of framing the conversations. And then a big chunk of Meet the Neighbors is, is about, things that seem simple on the surface, but I think are actually really profound underneath, the so-called pest control, or, or wildlife hospitals, people who really devote themselves to helping educate other people about coyotes and potentially dangerous animals. Because ultimately, what is going to determine the fate of so much life on this planet isn't just, like environmental conditions, or, like the biological carrying capacity of a certain habitat or something like that, but rather our values and how we think about animals, and, how we choose to live our lives and manage our communities. In that sense, this idea of the Anthropocene and human influence, but also like our values are inscribed on the planet and on the life around us.
Right.
And yeah, I hope people understand that.
Yeah. It's where we're interconnected, right? It's not
Totally.
us and them, and again, we're like encroaching on their spaces as well. So it's kind of like I see people get it mad. Like you said, Monica, you're seeing a bobcat and a deer, and the more we build, the more we have to understand our neighbors. So it's just,
bobcat.
Yeah, that's pretty cool,
Yeah,
Monica.
you're going to come to Serenbe. They're on the trails. We find them. Yeah.
They're super cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So what's next for you? So this book is out. You're obviously out promoting it. We'll put all the links
Thank you.
in the show notes. But what's next? What's sort of like, where's your curiosity driving you next that you're working on?
So, there's so many ideas I'd love to chase down, but sort of the three that I have on my plate right now, I'm working on an animal. I'm working on an article about how other animals understand beauty, whether animals have a sense of beauty.
Wow.
Another one on how animals understand death and whether, whether they have concept of death, a little less fun than
Oh,
beauty.
yeah.
And then sort of a much more sort of in the clouds piece is about the cognition of hermit crabs and how hermit crab intelligence helps coastal ecosystems persist and cohere across time, and how those ecosystems can also be understood as organisms who are potentially cognitive themselves. That's
Wow.
yeah.
Wow.
But
That's so
and I'm also thinking
It's
interesting.
about a book
amazing.
on
You're
squirrels.
starting to get squirrels. Squirrels are so fun. I love squirrels.
I know.
But that's really interesting. I love that you're saying sort of, it's this like, what if sort of the ecosystem consciousness, which I'm always fascinated with the story of trees and the
Mhm.
mushrooms and the connectivity, because that has its own intelligence
Absolutely.
that we're
Yeah.
starting to understand.
Yeah.
It is fascinating to me. Oh my God. I love it. Because you're like hermit crabs. That's going to
Right?
be great. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good. So you'll have to keep us updated on all three of those. Those sound incredible.
Yeah, they do.
Incredible.
And how
Yeah.
can we support you right now? Are there should we send people to a LinkedIn page or a website, or how can we, where do you want people to go to?
Yeah. Well, I'm on all the socials, and I have a newsletter on Substack that is probably the best way to
Great.
keep up with what I'm doing. And yeah, anybody who reads Meet the Neighbors, leave a review out there in the world, or ask your public library if they have it.
So important.
Make sure that everyone gets a chance.
Wonderful.
Great.
Well, we'll share all that in our
Well-
show notes. And yeah, thank you, Brandon. Thank you so much.
Oh, this was such a delight. And it was so lovely to talk to you. And we recommend the book to everybody. So thank you for all your time this morning.
It's really been a pleasure. Thank you.
So, Jennifer, I'm really intrigued by the concept of animal personhood. And we all know that I can be a bit of a language nerd, and the word personhood obviously connects so much importance and depth, but it also starts to get to the question of legal rights for animals.
I completely agree with you. I thought our conversation about legal rights was really interesting, and that the first step could be simply acknowledging that animals are entitled to rights.
Yes, and we already do that to a certain extent, right? Like you can go to jail for animal cruelty, but I think that Brandon is getting at it a little more nuanced. If science proves that certain animals have deep emotional capacity and cognitive ability, then is it wrong to keep them in zoos? Does it go against their rights?
Absolutely. It's so interesting. And to your point, it's very nuanced. Like Brandon said, confining certain animals like chimpanzees and elephants might be cruel, but a zoo environment is better suited to other species.
Not to completely switch gears, but I thought some of the examples that Brandon shared with us were also fascinating. There's evidence that bumblebees play and have a deep emotional life. The social component of bird navigation was fascinating. And I mean, these things are really, really deeply beautiful.
Yes, we really cannot recommend this book enough. It is linked in our show notes along with Brandon's Substack and some of his articles on this very subject. So definitely check those out.
All right. Talk again soon, Jen.
Bye, Monica.